tuned. The stream is about to begin.
All right, my teacher friends. So here's the backdrop for this lesson plan. There I was the other night watching the Knicks game, classic game. They get down by 29 points and the phone comes out, all right? And I start scrolling. And I get on these reels about the Jubal Show, and you guys might not be familiar with that. He does a lot of prank phone calls in a segment called War of the Roses to Catch a Cheater. And I'm just watching these and I'm getting sucked in, and the game is a blowout. They came back to win, though. As you know, the Knicks won the championship. And I just, in my English teacher mind, am watching the War of the Roses to Catch a Cheater. And I'm like, whoa, what a great way to teach logical fallacies. Cheaters often use some profoundly inane and insane logical fallacies. So I've put together this unit to teach logical fallacies and some of the main rhetorical moves in arguments. I think this is going to be a super high engagement exercise. I'll walk you through the whole process from the introductory activities all the way to the culminating essay, and I'll just map it all out for you. So hope you enjoy it. All right, my English teacher friends. So before I begin, just so that you know, all the material you need to run this lesson or this unit is down below in the video's description. Everything from the model essays to the activity setup themselves. So every slide that's forthcoming, you have access to down below. So in terms of the episodes that I'm going to show my kids, I've parceled through a lot of them, and some of them get pretty raunchy and are kind of rather out there, but the cool thing is any cursing is bleeped out, and I chose 5 rather innocuous ones. They're called Besties for the Resties, Is She a Little Too Close to His Brother, A Psychic Cheating Prediction, and He's Cheating with Timu Zendaya. And in these, there's very minimal cursing. They're really clean. They're school appropriate. So have no fear at all. So the essential question that I'm going to pose for this unit is, how do people use flawed reasoning to manipulate, persuade, or conceal the truth? So let me go through the cheater's playbook and talk about some of the logical fallacies that I see most prevalent in these clips. The first set are the deflection fallacies. So we have ad hominem. So when you attack the accuser instead of addressing the accusation, and I give simple examples here, like you're crazy instead of here's why you're wrong, right? So, example of ad hominem. And I have a logical fallacy little textbook. I can include it down below in the description, so students will have those printed and they'll have more fuller, well-developed explanations and exemplars for them. The other one's the straw man for the deflection fallacy. So misrepresenting the accusation. So you could say something like, so now I can't even have female friends when nobody even claimed that. Another deflection fallacy would be the red herring. Why are we talking about flowers? Let's talk about how you never trust me. So we get a lot of that going on in these little segments. And then the emotional fallacies, appeal to emotion. So trying to make the audience feel rather than think. After everything I've done for you might be a good example of that. Guilt tripping is another one. False dilemma, when you get into reasoning fallacies, either you trust me or this relationship is over, is something really common that you'll see. Hasty generalizations would be another reasoning fallacy, circular reasoning, and then psychological fallacies. This is a big one, gaslighting. And I do some rhetorical analysis units with my students that I have to unpack gaslighting. And one in particular, and I have a YouTube video on this, is the Richard Burton letter to Elizabeth Taylor is just loaded with gaslighting. I always try to anticipate what's going to get hurled at kids come exam time. And it wouldn't surprise me if sometime down the road we see some gaslighting in a text. So here's the first activity that I have, and it's called Fallacy Detective. So I'm just going to play like 3 to 5 minute segments from the episode. All of them are like, 8 to 9 minutes. I'll show them in the entirety, but for this particular exercise, it'll be the second or third watch. So I want them to get the quote fallacy evidence. You're acting crazy might be an example of ad hominem attacks person rather than the argument. You never trust me. Red herring, change the topic. So I want to really emphasize with students that they're not listening for who's right. They're not trying to catch the cheater. They're listening for who is engaging in poorly phrased reasoning. Activity 2 is the prosecution. And I'm going to split the class into 2 groups. And each group will act as the prosecutorial team, and their job is to build a case, identify what claim is being made, what evidence supports it, what fallacies weaken it. So I'm going to have one group create Exhibit A, Exhibit B. So A will be the quote, B will be the fallacy, and C will be the explanation for that. And then the students will present their findings like lawyers. I think that'll be a pretty cool exercise. Another activity that I want them to do, going above and beyond just locating the fallacy, is to rewrite the argument. And I think this is where their learning really will take a stand. So you take a flawed statement like, if you trusted me, you wouldn't be asking questions. Students rewrite it into a logically sound argument that might sound like this. I understand your concern. Here's why I believe the evidence doesn't support the conclusion. And this ultimately helps students distinguish between persuasion and manipulation. Now, the big thing is the culminating writing assignment. And my prompt goes like this. In the selected segment from War of the Roses to Catch a Cheater, participants attempt to defend themselves, accuse others, and shape audience perceptions. Write an essay analyzing how flawed reasoning influences the conversation and contributes to the conflict. Students can examine fallacies that create confusion, emotional appeals that replace evidence, how manipulation influences credibility, and why listeners are often persuaded by weak arguments. So I think this is really good stuff here. So as always, I'm going to walk you through it whenever I present essays to students early in the year. I always Bob Ross it. So let's start with the first logical question. So how do I write the introductory paragraph? And my students have 2 options. They can declare or invert. And in Bob Ross and these, I realized that the inverted technique works best. So they're going to begin with a duo, which I'll unpack in just a second. I want to see a little bit of tier 2 level vocabulary in there. And I just mean your average run-of-the-mill SAT level words. It is an academic paper, so they have an academic audience. Their diction should reflect that. Early in the year, I begin to teach my students sentence constructs. So there are 12 sentence types according to Strunk and White and 20 sentence patterns. I have a ton of activities in the YouTube channel if you want to delve into that with your students. I just find that it creates better voice, rhythm, and flow, and gets those struggling and emerging writers away from over-relying on independent clauses that create that ... type flow and rhythm. Want to see active verbs in the inverted thesis? You end with the thesis, and you got to supply a little bit of context and background without being overly plot summative. So here's the first one. Evasive yet deliberate. And that's what I mean by a duo. Evasive 1, deliberate 2. I find that when my students start like this, it precludes them from getting all plot dumpy on me, and it sets up a frame that gets them into the analysis. So evasive yet deliberate. Ben approaches Samantha's accusations not by confronting them, but by attempting to reshape the terms of the discussion itself. Through a pattern of misdirection and distorted reasoning, he seeks to control both the narrative and Samantha's perception of it. Yet the more aggressively he attempts to maintain this illusion, the more apparent its cracks become. Ultimately, Ben constructs a fragile defense designed to obscure his infidelity, only to see it collapse when confronted with undeniable evidence. So you can see the thesis always comes last. You want to be cooking some active verbs. And those sentence constructs, my rule is this, especially early in the year. Try to get rid of the parallelism. So as I said earlier, oftentimes students will just stack independent clauses. So it kind of sounds like a train track rhythm in it. So that's example one. Let's paint another one just to demystify it and see how it works. So yet again, you start with the duo. Calculated yet increasingly transparent. So always begin with that duo. Ben attempts to navigate Samantha's accusations by steering the conversation away from uncomfortable truth and toward a reality of his own making. So navigate and steering, good verbs. As suspicion mounts, his shifting explanations and questionable reasoning reveal a growing disconnect between the story he presents and the facts before him. What begins as a confident defense gradually unravels into a series of contradictions that expose the weakness of his position. And here comes the thesis. Ultimately, Ben manipulates the conversation in an effort to conceal his affair until the weight of the evidence leaves him with no choice but to confess. All right, same old thing. So simple thesis construction here. This is a nuts and bolts inverted thesis. So let's see it one more time. I always show my students 3, and then I pause and have them do theirs. And I should have said this earlier. The one that I am modeling, they can't use. So they have to choose one of the 5 that I listed in the earlier slides. Confident and yet unraveling. So there you got the duo. Ben initially presents himself as the voice of reason while casting doubt upon Samantha's suspicions. By redirecting attention away from the evidence and toward increasingly tenuous explanations, he attempts to preserve a version of events that serves his interest. However, each effort to maintain control of the narrative only deepens the inconsistencies embedded within it. Ultimately, Ben relies upon deception to shield his affair from scrutiny, but the truth emerges as his carefully constructed defense begins to crumble. So in that last sentence, you'll see a pattern there. I like to transition on that ultimately, or something closely akin to that, to show that you're wrapping up and you're going to drop the thesis in that last line. So the next question becomes, how do I write the body paragraphs? And those that are familiar with my work know that I always use the syllogistic method. It's an Aristotelian heuristic, so it comes from Aristotle. He ran a school called the Lyceum, and the town boys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling. And he noticed that when students were tussling with questions like, what is justice, which is the seminal question to Plato's Republic, that the really good orators had like a mathematical precision. And one day he had a eureka moment and he said, they're thinking syllogistically, they're arguing syllogistically. And all that means is when you're going from premise, conclusion. In AP language world, we call this line of reasoning. So if I were to say premise 1, arsenic is deadly. Premise 2, my dog ate arsenic. And I give you some context, and I say this morning I went out to make a cup of coffee, and there's Pickles, my dog, beneath the kitchen cupboards, the kitchen sink. And I say, oh no, Pickles, and he pulls his face out, and he's got white powder all over his muzzle and his grizzle. And I tell you that last night I put arsenic beneath the kitchen sink because we have a rat infestation problem. Logically, you're going to conclude, that's not going to bode well for Pickles. So morbid example, but you get my drift. Here's how we morph that heuristic for the purposes of writing our body paragraphs. In premise 1, you got to argue a why reason. up top in the thesis, you just kind of lay the platform down, and now you get into the minutiae of the why. Premise 2 is going to be the textual support. This is where you quote or paraphrase, and there's some math to this. I really like it when my students take 3 sentences to write the first premise, and it precludes them from that inability or that lack of keeping the argument central. We got to keep in mind that this is an expository essay. We're not summarizing. It's not plot analysis. It's not plot summation. We are arguing. So to keep that argument nice and locked up, I like to take 3 sentences. So in the 4th sentence, you begin to quote and or paraphrase. And in the conclusion of the syllogistic body paragraph, and I want to emphasize that, not the conclusion paragraph of the essay, but the conclusion of the body paragraph, you got to loop it and link it back to the prompt and come full circle on the syllogism. One little last piece of math, syllogistic body paragraphs tend to be 10 to 12 sentences long. So let's ask ourselves the question, what's a first premise look like? I got you covered. So I do give my kids stems in the beginning of the year, and I want them to work chronologically through text. So when they say things like right from the onset, it cues the reader into knowing that they have a methodological, chronological progression through their analysis. So I'm just modeling that here. Right from the onset, Ben recognizes that directly addressing Samantha's concerns would place him in a vulnerable position. Instead of engaging with the evidence before him, he attempts to redirect the conversations toward issues that are easier to defend and less damaging to his credibility. By shifting the focus away from the accusation itself, he establishes a pattern of evasion that allows him to delay accountability while maintaining the appearance of innocence. And one thing that I really like my students to do in their first premises is imply the term, so you can see the implication of the logical fallacies in here, the implications of the ethos. I think it's more skillful to go that route. Some of my students might need to be more explicit than others, depending on their skill, just to make sure that they're arguing. So let's see another first premise. You can see the stem's going to stay the same. Right from the onset, Ben attempts to seize control of the conversation before Samantha's suspicions can gain any real traction. Rather than allowing the decision to revolve around the evidence she presents, he subtly reframes the situation in a manner that casts doubt upon her concerns. This effort to shape the narrative on his own terms provides him with a temporary shield from scrutiny, enabling him to maintain his deception for as long as possible. So another point to consider here, still doing the same thing with the verbs, doing the same thing with the sentence constructs. So let's now transition to the second premise. I have one last stem for us. I like it when my students say immediately because it ties back to right from the onset. Now, in the writing samples here, I want to talk about how to use a variety of quote frames, things like ellipses, brackets, quote sandwiches, multiple quotes in a single sentence, and I'll introduce my 5-word rule in just a second. So we're at the 4th sentence, and I want to see my kids start to quote or paraphrase. So immediately when Samantha questions why Ben sent flowers to someone named Brianna M., he dismisses the accusation by insisting that she's always looking for problems where none exist. So here's the deal with the 5-word rule. If a student places a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keeps the quote relatively small, it should sound conversational. You'll see that in that quote, I use brackets. We want to keep it conversational. All right. So moving on, that people who trust their partners don't investigate florist receipts, subtly implying that suspicion itself is the real issue. So you can see multiple quotes in one sentence. When Samantha points out that the card reads, "Thanks for all the Big Macs," Ben abruptly pivots, claiming that the flowers were merely a gesture of appreciation for an outstanding fast food professional. Deflecting further, he asks, Why are we talking about flowers when we should be discussing your inability to support local businesses? As the evidence mounts, Samantha notes that Brianna works the grill at McDonald's, prompting Ben to argue that eating Big Macs is not a crime, even though nobody accused him of criminal behavior. He then gaslights her by insisting that she's remembering the receipt wrong and that the words love Ben were actually probably a coupon code. When Samantha reveals that Brianna received matching flowers on 3 separate occasions, Ben responds with a false dilemma, insisting that she can either trust him completely or live a life ruled by paranoia. Doubling down, he claims that he's too dedicated to cheeseburgers to have time for an affair, as though his devotion to fast food somehow disproves the accusation. Yet when the show's host revealed that Brianna has already identified him as her boyfriend, Ben abandons his elaborate defense and sheepishly admits that he has, in fact, been secretly dating the McDonald's grill worker. So we're at the conclusion here. In a final moment of absurd honesty, he confesses that what began as a shared appreciation for Big Macs eventually turned into something deeper, supersized, if you will. All right, so that takes you through the whole second premise and conclusion. Let's see it again. So same stems. Immediately when Samantha confronts Ben about repeatedly visiting the same McDonald's 3 times a day, he scoffs that she's clearly spending too much time monitoring his lunch schedule. Rather than address the accusation directly, he suggests that anyone who keeps track of another person's fast food habits might be the one with the problem. When Samantha mentions seeing the flirtatious messages from a contact saved as Burger Queen, Ben quickly reframes the issue, insisting that networking with restaurant employees is an essential life skill. Pressed further, he argues that if everyone got accused every time they ordered a quarter pounder, society would completely collapse. As Samantha reads aloud a text that says, "Can't wait to see you after your shift," Ben claims that the heart emoji was merely an expression of enthusiasm for affordable menu options. Attempting to sow doubt, he insists that she has omitted important context, noting that the text could have been discussing fries. Nobody knows for sure. When Samantha points out that the messages span several months, Ben responds by arguing that she either trusts him unconditionally or intends to sabotage the relationship. Growing increasingly desperate, he claims that a man committed to Big Mac simply doesn't have the emotional bandwidth for infidelity. Yet the facade crumbles when the show's producers reveal that the employee has identified Ben as her secret boyfriend and provided details about their relationship. At the conclusion here, cornered by the evidence, Ben finally concedes that his connection to the McDonald's grill worker extended well beyond his appreciation for hamburgers, admitting that their romance was built upon what he describes as a mutual passion for beef buns and bad decisions. And that's the whole kit and caboodle right there. So that's how you would do the body paragraphs, all right? A little bit of explication and implication for the logical fallacies. So let's wrap it up with a conclusion paragraph. I used an analogy early in the year that's this. So I think conclusions are closely akin to a fireworks display in the grand finale of the fireworks display. You want to do the all-encompassing, all-encapsulating statements, things like at the end of the day, evidentially, when it's all said and done, simply put, just takes like 4 sentences, so you could do this. At the end of the day, Ben's elaborate defense demonstrates that even the most confident arguments crumble when they are built upon deception rather than truth. I'm noticing that I say crumble a lot in this. I got to change my verbs up. I caught myself. Although he repeatedly attempts to redirect attention, distort reality, and undermine Samantha's concerns, each tactic ultimately serves to expose the weakness of his position. Ironically, the very strategies designed to conceal his misconduct become the evidence that reveals it. In the end, Ben's confession illustrates that no amount of flawed reasoning can permanently disguise the truth, even when fueled by a shared love of Big Macs. So that's the whole essay right there. Simple 4-paragraph essay. If you want to reach out for any reason, you can drop me a line at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. Hope you and your students have fun with this one. I think it's going to be a high engaging, high interest piece and get us talking about rhetoric in some meaningful ways. So be well for now.